Hey everyone, welcome back to our first session of day two. This is going to be a really interesting follow on from yesterday, as we're looking at stories for learning, an introduction for instructional designers with Damien. I shan't waste anyone's time. I will hand over straight away. Take it away. The stage is yours.
Lovely, thank you. Good morning. Welcome everyone. There'll now be a small moment while I try and wrestle with the technology. And hopefully you are now all seeing my presentation. I'm going to trust Tom's going to jump and say if there's a problem. So first of all, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks Tom for organising all this. It's a really great honour to be part of such a great lineup of speakers and be part of the whole IDTX thing. So this is, as I said, an introduction for instructional design about stories for learning. So welcome everyone. Let's get started. Let's get into it. So I guess like most people, it's useful to think about, come on, there we go. They want to move. So I thought about where I started with stories, how I became interested in them. Like most people, my connection with stories started as a child. Now, I was raised in rural Ireland. It was long ago, sadly, and seems far away. I was mostly raised by my grandmother, a very proper Catholic matriarch, who, incidentally, I didn't understand the strength of character it must have taken at the time for her to have raised the son, a grandson, when there was no sign of a father around, which is another matter. Now, about once a year, a smartly dressed older man would come to our house. He was, as I was to discover later in life, a shanachie, a travelling storyteller. Now, even then, that tradition would have been dying. My grandmother would make him tea and cake, and he would tell stories. Now, everything from local news. Now, bear in mind, we didn't have a car or a phone, nor did most people we knew, so news from more than a few miles away was very hard to come by. And this was of great interest to my grandmother. Of more interest to me as a young child were the tales of ghosts, fairy folk, hanging trees, of heroes and battles, and such. Later in the afternoon, he would head off to the village where he would spend the evening in one of the pubs, telling, I suspect, somewhat different stories, for a good storyteller knows their audience. Now, I was very young. I remember much of the detail of any of those stories, but the feelings the stories created marked me forever. They contributed to things like my passion for the theatre. It's how I ended up in learning development, and beyond that, to this talk here this morning. So why stories for learning? Now, stories, I think, rather like games and play, are sometimes seen as the preserve of children, not the sort of thing that, grown-ups deal with and certainly don't have a place in the world of work. Now, I suspect if you hear at this talk, you don't maybe see it that way, but I think it's worth maybe having a little bit of the background of it, just so when you're trying to bring stories into something, if you encounter a story skeptic, you can kind of got some background with it. So, like most people, talking about the history of stories, we go a long way back, and let's consider our ancestors who, tens of thousands of years ago, they faced many challenges. Could they find food, water, shelter, resources? They were wherewithal to make tools to address really practical problems, to survive and thrive in a hostile environment. And somewhere along the line, humans developed vocal language. Now, for all kind of reasons, it's very hard to pin down when that happened. There's a broad consensus in a window somewhere around 1 to 200,000 years ago, but there's some outliers. There are people who say it goes back to we could potentially have spoken 3 million years ago, and some who say it's more recent, well less than 100,000 years. But there's a window there where we started to speak, and we haven't really shut up since then. So the question has to be, why? What was the problem? Why did we want to speak, and why did it help us? So I'd like you to imagine for a moment you're one of our ancestors, a hunter-gatherer. You get up when the sun rises, you look around at your group, you pull out your day planner, consider, what am I going to do today? What am I going to do with my time? Well, the clue is in the job title. You're going to do hunting and gathering, and you're going to do it pretty much all day, because getting hold of enough food, water, and resources is typically very hard work. Now, studies of surviving hunter-gatherer communities suggest that during the day, most communication is very functional. It's of the go there for food, stay away from there, that's dangerous, what time is lunch kind of variety. Now, interestingly, for a lot of that, Non-verbal communication is actually fine. Hand gestures, odd noises. And if you don't believe me, just think about the last time you watched a movie about the SAS, the American Navy SEALs. And one of the things you really often see with them is the use of hand signals and non-verbal comms, because they're quite precise, they're very discreet, they're a good way of communicating very specific messages. So your day is full of activity, and the sun sets, it's dark. The day is over. You have food and water and resource. So what problem do we have? Well, humans are social animals. And this study indicates this graph is kind of the growth in need. As our brains became more complex, we had a need for more social time. We also discovered that living in larger social groups was more successful. It was a more successful strategy. But social groups meant we needed social time. But all during the day, we're hunting and gathering. Now, this paper by Dr. Robin Dunbar's links the growth of two things, which is fire and language. And he suggests that what we're able to do with fire is extend the day. You now have light and heat. You can sit around, you can cook some food, you can eat. You can't really work. You can't make tools. You certainly can't hunt, because most of our predators have got much better night vision than we do. So you can engage in social activity. You can talk and tell stories, and the growth of the two are linked. Now, if we look again at surviving hunter-gatherer communities, what we found at this point in the day, after the work part of the day is finished, that about 80% of the social time is spent around social storytelling, and a lot of that storytelling is actually focused on things like social cohesion, equality, group behaviors, expected behaviors. So it's really quite an important part of how we as humans learn to understand, as prehistory sense of this is what we do, this is how you behave as a human. And if I come back to Shanachie, now, what is generally taken to mean an Irish storyteller, the actual translation of the word is slightly different. In fact, it means a custodian of tradition. So there, from prehistory to pre-television Ireland, we see a clear line with stories being used to teach. In large part, they're how we understood the world, how we functioned in it, and norms and expected behavior. Really important lessons, things that enable us to thrive and survive as a great species. So I believe, to some extent, we didn't learn to tell stories because we could talk, but we learned to talk so we could tell stories. So fundamental were they to our success as a species. So we've had this for, say, let's call it 100,000 years. That's got to have made some impact on us and the way and our relationship with stories today on a kind of really deep level. So the first thing to think about is, the mind believes stories. Sorry, we miss stories. I apologize, I missed the slide. Once upon a time. So we like stories. After 100,000 years, we are effectively programmed to expect stories. When someone starts a story, the brain is automatically keyed to think, oh, this is important. This is an interesting thing. And if you don't believe me, look at how big business stories are. Books, TVs, movies, games, stand-up comedy, nearly all of them, that works contains a really well-defined story element. We may not be consuming stories around the campfire anymore or my grandmother's kitchen, but we still, as a species, have an inbuilt appetite for story that's close to insatiable. We believe stories. The mind believes in the sense that if you actually how we interact with the world, that our mind is actually locked in a box and it creates a model of the world as it goes along. And stories feed into that to the extent that if you interact with a story and you happen to have your head in an MRI scanner at the time, very similar parts of the brain the same parts will light up as if you're actually engaging in the activities in the story. Now, don't get me wrong, on a conscious level, we know they're not true, but if you've ever talked to someone who's watched, say, EastEnders or Coronation Street or another drama like that, they really are very committed. They believe that they know those characters aren't real, and yet they have a relationship with them as if they almost were. And that's about the way the brain has a very deep attraction and affinity with stories as an almost real thing. The story is very emotional. Emotion is very important to us, and stories can really help tap into a range of emotions and emotional drivers, and that results in the release of different chemicals in the brain. So we get things like dopamine released if we tell a story that builds suspense, and that creates focus and motivation, helps with memory. Oxytocin which helps generosity and trust, or endorphins, which makes us positive and creative. And depending on the type of story you're telling or listening to, it may be one or more, some combination of those. So they have a really kind of an actual direct chemical effect on the brain. And that's important because in the end, humans are not as rational as we like to think. There's a lot of work exploring the rationality in our brain and the fact that a lot of decision making is actually intuitive. Now, a lot of you will have read, I guess, the chimp paradox. There's other books on the subject. But when I was researching this, I came across quite a nice analogy. There's this, obviously, primordial, very old part of our brain, on which is there's a smaller, more modern conscious part, the conscious and less intuitive part. And it's a little like riding an elephant. When the elephant wants to go where you both want to go in the same way, it's fine. But if the elephant wants to go left and you want to go right, you're probably going to go left. And what actually happens to humans is we go left, and afterwards we go, I wanted to go left all along, really. The conscious part post-rationalizes it. What stories do is provide us a way to try to make the elephant go where we want it to go, to head right and not left, because it thinks right's going to be interesting. One of the kind of interesting, I guess, more modern theories about learning is effective context theory, of which Nick Shackleton-Jones is a significant advocate. It's also from the resources, not courses school. In a vast simplification of this, and I hope I don't offend anybody who's more familiar with this, but it effectively says that learning relies on a form of emotional coding. If you look back on most of the things you remember, you can trigger those memories have an emotional element of some degree. And Nick takes this to say, well, generally speaking, we learn what we care about. And he would cite things like TikTok and YouTube, where people can go and learn about how to change a plug or how to write a book or whatever. Whatever you want to do, you go and learn it. And no one's assigning you that learning. No one's put it into a learning management system and tracking and marking you on it. But there's massive amount of people going to learn it because they care. And he would say that one of the problems that we in L&D have is quite often what we're trying to teach people to do is things that they don't care about. And that's a big problem because then they don't want to do it, and the elephant doesn't really want to go there. Stories are a way of getting the learner to care. They're a part of that situation that makes them think, oh, actually, this is interesting, and brings that focus and motivation to the learning by getting them into seeing the emotional strand of it. So that's the background and I guess the context of why I think stories are really important, why they really bring something to learning, and with a long evolutionary history of being part of how we evolved as a species, are actually a tool that we really need to lever and not to get distracted by the modern world of it's all about facts and it's all about figures. So when I set this up, I think I promised you that I would talk about two types of story for learning. So let's consider the first type of story. And I would ask you to think, what do these three things have in common? And there's two things. Firstly, they're all sort of hunters, ironically. Story hunter is hunting for food. An AA patrol hunts for faults, and so does photocopier engineers. And there's a very famous example for both the AA and rank Xerox of their photocopier engineers of one of the ways that learning was passed from one engineer to another, from one patrol to another, was a very similar fashion to the way Stone Age hunters did. And it's one of the kind of human superpowers of being able to learn vicariously, but without the need for first-hand experience. So your photocopier engineer, they go along to a job, they look at the fault code, or they look at what it says in the manual, they do that, doesn't fix it. They try something else, that doesn't fix it. They improvise, they come up with a solution, resolves the problem. The next time they get together, they share that. They talk about, oh, well, I had this, I had to do this difficulty, there's the challenge, there's the failure. And others in the group have learned from, oh, okay, this is the thing that may come up. And this is what I like to think of as an anecdote, a type of story, a real story. Something told by a trusted peer, usually in their own words. And it has a nice sort of structure, though, in that it will usually have a beginning. I went to look at this vehicle. I went to look at this photocopier. I did these things in the middle. There's the challenge. It didn't work. and then I resolved it. I came up with a solution. And those stories would pass through word of mouth in grouping settings. Obviously, these days, we're much more advanced. We try to capture those things into a knowledge base. But historically, that's how it would have worked. There would have been this sharing and talking. A story, an anecdote would pass that would help them. And this very much fits in, for those of you who are advocates of 70-20-10, a lot of the 70 is the anecdotes, the stories that are shared between peers that as people work, the way they talk about how they do things, those anecdotes make up a big part of it, and they're very powerful. Anecdotes have great power. I guess to paraphrase Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility, because while it's tempting to see anecdotes as a really useful, and they are very useful, we also have to remember that they can be used to exclude and to marginalize others if you're not within the group. When that story is being told for whatever reason, you may not get to share to understand it. They can also, I think, form a bedrock that resists cultural change. I think if you look at some very big organizations, perhaps uniformed services, where for a long time they've had an endeavor to make some cultural change through the 10 and of formal training, the 20 of formal coaching. One of the things that has resisted change is the 70, the anecdotal, a bit of, that's not how it is really like on the streets. That's not what it's really like when you get out into the world. And that is a really big issue where anecdote can be a big problem. So I give you that word of caution, but they are very useful, and in learning and development, they're a powerful tool. If I've done you, but I've often would run courses, and you get to the end of those 3 days or whatever, and say to somebody, the group, so what was the best thing? What was really useful? And somebody would go, oh, it's when Jane talked about how she dealt with those customers and how she dealt with that problem. And I think, well, that's 3 days of my life, I'm never getting back. But of course, we designed in that time, that moment, to allow them to share. So structuring and creating those things can work very well. So I would encourage you to actively seek out those stories. Where are the stories that fit with the narrative, that fit with what you're trying to achieve through your learning and development process? Encourage user generation. The more you can get the users to tell the stories, remember they're much stronger in their own words, they're much stronger if they're identifiably from the group. There's some great tools that support that kind of thing these days. The one I'm somewhat familiar with is Storyteller, which is a neat tool for allowing self-video creation. So, if someone has something they want to share, they do a selfie video. They can do it as often as they like. They don't feel watched, not under pressure. When they're happy with it, they send it off to you. And the nice bit is there's a bit of curation, there's a bit of control in terms of being able to share out the ones that work and control that dissemination. So anecdotes, really powerful, really useful tool. Just kind of be mindful and make sure you make the best of them, but do seek them out. So that then leads us to the other kind of story for learning. And I guess having talked about real stories that come from the audience, the obvious place to go is to get creative and talk about made-up stories we're going to create specifically for learning. Now, if you spend any amount of time talking about reading and researching stories, you'll come across there's a myriad of story structures for creating stories. There's Journey's Monument 3-act structure. There's a 5-act structure. I think there's also a 12-act structure. There's a plethora. There's an industry actually in writing books about how to write books and stories and all those things. And they're very useful and they're very thoughtful, and I would encourage people to read them. But at this level, at an introductory level, where what we're looking to do is to create a learning moment, I'm going to suggest that they're really just overkill, and they make it feel on things unnecessarily difficult. They complicate things, and we want to go back to, well, what do we want our story to do? What are we trying to achieve here? And I think what we're trying to do is we want to create engagement, add an emotional hook, and probably prompt discussion and prompt interaction and get people to engage with what we're doing. And how we do that, I think, is to bring some very simple basic story elements that we can deploy very easily. And so we're going to look at, well, a learning story needs a character or characters. It should have a character that the audience can relate to. So if you're doing a story about customer service operatives, agents, the story probably shouldn't be about the customer services director and his struggles, because they're not going to relate to that. They're not going to care. You need it to be about somebody close to them, somebody they can identify with. And then, like any good story, it needs conflict. There needs to be some grit in the machine, some problem, something that causes an issue. Now, in a typical story, you would have character and conflict, and then if you look back to like our anecdote stories, that would be, beginning, middle, and you'd have an end. Now, the difference I think with these learning stories is the resolution phase, because this is where the learning happens. So perhaps rather than just giving them an ending, we want to think about, well, how do we make that a learning experience instead? Start with character, create conflict, use your resolution. So 2 elements and a model at the end. So then you might say, well, Damien, that's very all well and good, but you're still asking me to create character and conflict. Where am I going to get those things from? Well, everybody's favorite, and now people would say perhaps old processes, ADDIE is a good instructional design process. We are, at the end of the day, instructional designers. We're not playwrights or authors. We are creating stories for learning. So what do you want to do, ADDIE or 5DI or 5C or whatever your preferred model is, they all start pretty much similarly with an analysis or a definition or a diagnosis phase or a clarification phase, whatever it is. And for stories in particular, what you want to come out of that are a couple of things. You want a really clear audience profile, and you want some objectives. Now, I haven't said learning objectives or performance objectives here. We'll come on to that in a moment. And those really, really key things that you're going to want to dive into, and you want to have some depth in if you're going to use stories. So with the audience, well, yes, of course, you want to know what do they do. So they're customer service agents, they're salespeople. But we need a lot more than that. We want to think, well, what are they like? Are they of a particular, have they got degrees? Do they typically not have degrees? Are they of a certain age group? Are there groups of people? Are they from an age? What kind of background are they from? What are their issues? Why do they do what they do? Why do they not do other things that they should do? We need to understand those motivations. What are the things that make the audience behave the way it does and drives those things? So you want a good, quite detailed understanding of your audience. So that's one hand. And then we're going to come on to objectives. So they might be about performance. They might be about learning. A good performance objective might sound, we want to increase sales by 5%. We want to reduce call waiting time by 5%. But for what we want, we need things that are very observable. So what are the observable things that drive that outcome? So we say, well, we're looking to uplift sales of this product by 10% through this training. So that's a nice, very performance-focused piece of training, a measurable outcome. But for us, in terms of a story, what we would want to look and say, well, okay, what are the behaviors? What are the specific things? If I watch the salesperson who sells more of that product, what would they do? And therefore, from that, I can derive an action list. I can say, well, these are the actions, the steps that drive the outcome, and these are the things we could observe. And bear in mind that because we're often talking about people, you can observe through listening as well as through watching. So somebody saying the right thing is also an observable behavior. But understanding, isn't it? If you go back to learning objectives, if you've hung out with me ever on LinkedIn, the learning objectives are an interesting area, but for another time. So now we have a profile, we have some objectives, and we have an action list. So your story effectively comes down to, you have a character who has representative of the audience. They have a name. And that's quite important because you do want them, giving them a name will make it easier for people to relate to them, rather than if you just say, here is a customer service agent, here is a salesperson. There's two schools. One says if you don't give them a name, it allows them to paint onto them more. But in general, it's better to give them a name so people can have that kind of attachment. There's a whole interesting debate about naming, but most people suggestion is that you create your character and then you give them a name based on what they feel like to you. That they feel like a Sean or a Jane or a Gary. You don't start with, you give them the name you feel lives with them. They want to have some depth and some backstory. That's not hugely. I'm maybe a little too prone to depth and backstory, if I was to be honest. But it's useful in that you want them to have a bit of a life and a bit of a feeling, and that also helps to make them more realistic and to behave in a realistic way and have realistic motivations. You know, people who come for training or are being developed, they're not doing the things they maybe should be doing because they're bad or because they're somehow odd. They go to work wanting to do a good job, but they have struggles. They have things that stop them doing that. And that really is where the conflict comes in. You know, they're in conflict with things, one or more things on our action list that they need to be doing to get the desired outcome. And something in their motivations, in their behavior, in the circumstance is stopping them doing it. And so what you get to, if you want to really simplify the story down, is you end up with this. This is a story about name, and it might be one character, might be a couple of characters, who is and who struggles too, a thing you can observe. So I guess I thought about one. So this is a story about Cassandra, who's a customer service team leader and struggles to give challenging feedback to members of her team. And that's particularly important because that's the bit we want to be able to observe, is her giving that challenging feedback. Now, that's quite high level. And if we were doing this for real, you'd want to break that down into a lot more specific increment, a number of enabling actions to say, well, okay, well, what does that look like? But that's not that's the a bit more detail of the process, but it is just looking at the steps. What are those enabling pieces that fit within it? And from that, we come to, let's call this Cassandra, who I said has a name, has some background, has a realistic setup of, this is not a job she really chose. It fell into it, liked it, did well. It has an interest outside of work, has a life, been promoted, has some challenges with the team, has a lot of new hires. So it gives her a mixture of motivations when we come on to try to work with her. And then there's also Darren. Now, Darren is going to be like the team member here. So he's been around, he's generally good, but he's having some trouble. His scores have been dropping slowly, yeah. But he's also mentoring somebody new. So he's got his own challenges. So but it gives us a nice story where both the team members, if you were doing this with agents or you're doing this with recently promoted team leaders, could maybe relate to those situations and those people because they feel realistic and they feel genuine. So our setup is Cassandra needs to give Darren some feedback because his scores have been dropping. They've spoken previously, but didn't get into specifics. You know, felt Darren's an experienced agent. And Darren felt it was all a bit unfair because he's having to mentor people and he's putting things back into the business that's holding him up. So remember again, where Cassandra is in conflict with the action list. What are the actions we would say she should do if she's going to give feedback to Darren? And that then plays through in a kind of a setup situation where we would get something like this, where Cassandra comes, says, "Oh, hey, Darren, I need to talk to you about your QA scores. They still haven't improved." "Oh, Cassie, man, I can't believe they're still going on about that. Well, all these many new people here, what am I to do?" "Yeah, I guess, but we still need to sort your score out. Well, where do you think you could improve?" "Oh, I don't really know. I mean, I take a lot of the tricky calls. I think that could be hurting my scores." "I guess. But I mean, it's part of my job to take some of that stress. So why don't you pass some of those calls to me?" "Look, I'll get on top of this. You train me. It's not me. It's just we're all doing our best here with the way things are. We're all good, yeah?" Yeah, sure. I'm here to help." So Cassandra gets the end of it. I didn't go like I'd hoped. And then the question is, what you need to think about is the learning. What happens next? And I put it together as a very quick piece, but you could do a couple of minutes around Cassandra, maybe Darren, maybe Cassandra and another character, someone that one of the people she was even friendlier with on the team is often one of those issues. And then having set up the situation of she's got this challenge, we know she needs to do well with the job because she's trying to save money, needs to improve things, there's a real situation. Then you get into your work as instructional designer. How do you make that story, having got people interested, got them somewhat invested in the characters, to think, okay, how do we make this into learning? Now, what happens next? The discovering the resolution, discovering different ways for Cassandra to interact with Darren, thinking about what went wrong, what she could have done differently, how she could have moved things forward. That discovery process, that engagement process, is where all of the learning happens. And it really does work, and it's really very powerful. So what you do next is what makes it from a story to a learning story, and it's really important, and it's that work as instructional designer that makes the difference. And just from that moment of that breakdown of Cassandra, who's a service team leader, who can't give challenging feedback to team members, you're able to open up from those two lines a whole segue into a training about discussion and discovery. So I guess my question to you would be, where does the story for learning fit into your work? Where could you bring it in to engage people, to get them emotionally committed to the things we want them to start looking at, and how you can make that work? That's really all I have for you. I'd like to thank you for your time. I'm sorry if I spoke more quickly than I intended. I was a little nervous, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm sure if there's any questions or comments, I'm very happy to take them. And I'm sure Tom will let me know.
Yeah, Damien, that was really fantastic. Thank you so much for doing that. Again, I think because we're running a little late on time today, where I started a little late, we're going to have to go straight to the next session. But that really, really was so interesting. I know I took a lot from that, especially Story Tagger. I've never heard of that bit of software before. That looks fantastic. So that's going to be an immediate research job for me there.
Well, that's really well. I'm glad you felt that was useful. And as an anecdote tool, it's really powerful. Okay, thanks, everyone. I said I'm on LinkedIn if anyone wants to hook me up. I'm just Damien Scully. I'm there. Look, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day, and speak to you all again soon. Tom, thanks again for putting this on.
No, it's been a pleasure. Do pop your URL for your LinkedIn profile in the chat on the way out.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.